Okay, for 6.5, we're going to talk about reform movements. Reform means to make changes. So your objective for today is students will be able to analyze how the progressive movement attempted to solve the problems of the era. So the progressive era happened from 1895 to 1920, and it was the idea that the government needed to address the issues caused by industrialization. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was the U.S. president from 1901 to 1909. Often called Teddy Roosevelt. And he led a reform movement called the Square Deal, which was his attempt to address issues caused by industrialization. And that's what we see here, right? Like, here we have, this is Teddy right there. You can see it says investigation on his rack. He's trying to deal with the meat scandal, which came from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. The Jungle was what we call a muckraking book, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And it exposed the atrocities in the Chicago meat industry, which was essentially that there was a lot of unsanitary and rather disturbing conditions in the meat industry. And so we've got Teddy Roosevelt attempting to address that issue, and obviously it looks like the investigation is just covered in it, so it's not going very well. After Roosevelt, we had Wilson. Wilson was president from 1913 to 1921. And he expanded or addressed the Square Deal, the failures of the Square Deal, into what we called the New Freedom. And that was, again, an attempt to address the issues. And one of those issues was what we know as the working conditions. Working conditions, people worked for 12-hour days. There were no benefits. There were a lot of injuries. And so what that led to was we had these people called muckrackers. And they were journalists who exposed working conditions. One of the biggest eye-opening events was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory tragedy. And what we know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is there was a fire. The women were locked in the room. With no way to escape. And essentially we saw 141 people were killed. Mostly women. So that really opened up people's eyes to the working conditions and the fact that we needed reform, right? We need to have regulations to ensure safe working environments. So one way to do that was through labor unions. So labor unions were groups of working individuals who fought for improved working conditions. And these still exist today. One specific group of that was trade unions, and these are groups of unions for a specific trade instead of just a general one. The Knights of Columbus Labor Union were associated with two different riots, the Haymarket Riot and the Homestead Riot. The Haymarket Riot took place in Chicago. And what it was is workers wanted an 8-hour workday. And so they ended up rioting. So they ended up going on strike, which turned into a riot, which then led to 2 union members killed. And then a bomb exploded, killing 8 police officers. And then you also had the Homestead Steel riots, which were extremely violent as well. So these 2 events, the riots led to a negative name, or negative name for unions, especially the Knights of Columbus. Then we had the American Federation of Labor. This was the most successful union. They used what we call collective bargaining. And they would gain an advantage because all workers would support a set of written demands. the Pullman strike. A Pullman was a person who worked on the railroad. So a Pullman was a railroad employee. And so the Pullman strike was the railroad union who was led by Eugene Debs. Wanted to go on strike for better wages. And part of this was because the Pullmans were completely controlled by the railroad companies. So the railroad companies had them live in communities where they owned the buildings, and then they made them pay rent, and the rent was essentially what they were making. So they really had very little money because they were completely controlled by the railroads. Another part of labor unions was child labor. And the reason why is because they actually were not included in unions. They were too young. But they worked mostly in coal mines because they were little. So they could get in where they needed to get in. And textile factories. And many of them worked 8 to 10-hour days. You can see a group of them over here. Newsies waiting for the sun to open at 3 a.m. Newsies were little boys or young boys that would get a set of newspapers and then sell them on the street. Okay, as a result of all of the problems that we were having because of industrialization, there were some efforts to try to reform or fix some of those issues. So we had the ICC, which was the Interstate Commerce Commission. So this helped to regulate interstate commerce, so trading between two states. And in 1902, we had the Virginia SCC. And the goal of this was to regulate railroads and utilities so that there wasn't as much corruption. This led us to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned business activities that reduced competition. So in other words, they tried to eliminate monopolies. Sorry. And then on a different form, so these were both government. But then we also had individuals that tried to cause reform. Jane Addams Hull House is a picture right here. It took place in Chicago. And it was an effort to support immigrants, new immigrants. And it was what we would call a social center. They had things like plays, art. They even had kindergarten. But they would also teach classes, allow immigrants to do laundry, and a variety of other resources. We call this a settlement house. And there were many throughout the country, but this is one of the major and first examples of a settlement house. So a house to allow people to settle into the country. One of the biggest reform movements was women's suffrage. A suffrage was anyone who supported the woman's right to vote. Some of the most famous suffragists were Susan B. Anthony, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Some of the feelings nationwide were that Western territories and states would accept women in politics, and Eastern and Southern states did not. So this eventually led us into the 19th Amendment, which was passed finally in 1920, and it gave women the right to vote. And that is it.